Hey, what's going on, guys? You're listening to the Road Trip podcast, and today I'm here with Lyle McDonald. He's really been one of my favorite nutrition and fitness writers for a long time. And funny enough, if you're big into the fitness industry, you'll tend to see that a lot of people pull from his work because he was really one of the first people to come in and break things down in a very simple, easy-to-read way. And his website, Body Recomposition, really understood the goal, and it was just fantastic work. So we can talk a little bit about that, Lyle. First question is when did you start the site, and how did you get into the fitness stuff?
I'll answer the second question first. I actually came up or was raised in sort of a middle-class suburban white household. I was there during the video game revolution, arcades. I really wasn't a very athletic kid, and I mean, I'd still joke about it because I still have a little bit of the taste for this food. White bread, bologna, cheese, mayonnaise sandwiches, Cheetos, Little Debbie snack. Like that's what I was raised on. Didn't eat a lot of vegetables. Got to high school, and my high school had mandatory athletics. It was a very classic preparatory school, so it was, academics, gentleman scholar, athlete was sort of a, sorry, my dog has one of my socks. Very classical education, and we had mandatory sports. So I got involved in, running cross country, which I was awful at, and we had, what we called weights and agiles, which is a weight room thing, and at that ran into a guy that was a bicyclist and started riding a bike that summer, and I kind of liked what was happening as I was a little chubby little kid and started getting active, and I was on the swim team, and I got into martial arts because this was the 80s when everyone was into that. And I really, like I said, it sort of grabbed me even then as something I really liked. And at that point, there was information out there, a lot of books. I read all the muscle magazines looking for those secrets. But that sort of, it sort of was the thing I wanted to do. Then I got into my senior year of high school and got into gymnastics, actually by way of cheerleading, believe it or not, and wanted to go to UCLA to study physiology, or exercise physiology, so I could be an underpaid, overworked gymnastics coach. While I was there, briefly flirted with physical therapy, and then I got into inline skating, which was a very new sport. This is when the first fad kind of hit. The race circuit was developing. Got involved in that, really loved racing, really loved that competitive aspect. I'd done some triathlons and stuff when I was in high school, and that just sort of drove my interest. And since I was in the field, I was being bombarded by the same supplement ads, the same articles, the same nonsense that's there now. And I would go to my professor and ask him questions and bug him every day. Eric Sternlicht, who was one of my exercise physiology professors. He used to be on Body Shaping back in the ESPN days. I used to make fun of him for being on that show. And, at that point, I found myself reading a lot of the original research. I got very interested in the science of performance, training, nutrition, supplementation. And it was honestly to make myself a better athlete. That's how a lot of people get into these areas. Psychologists want to fix themselves, and good coaches frequently want to make themselves better athletes, and I got very deeply into the science of it. And then 93, 94 rolled around, and Greg and I were talking about this when we first sat down, and the internet was starting. And this was a very new thing, and I had the old slow modem and 4 hours of AOL and got online and liked writing and Usenet, which was an early, way before forums and Misc Fitness weights, and sort of kind of started establishing my reputation as being very science-driven and very evidence-based way before anybody talked about that, because there's so much nonsense in the field. And that just kind of led into the late 90s when the internet started and websites knew they needed to exist but didn't know why. And there were a lot of websites that the business model was build a website, do something in the middle, and then profit. But nobody really knew what they were supposed to be doing. But I got paid very well to write a lot of articles for a lot of sites, which then, of course, crashed because they didn't have any income. That would sort of lead me obliquely into my first book about low-carbohydrate diets. Dan Duchaine, who was the very notorious drug guru, came up with this very unique book called Body Opus in the late 90s, I would say. And it was this sort of cyclical ketogenic diet. So it was 5 days of low carbs and 2 days of high carbs. And I spent the summer doing that and got very interested in it and would end up publishing my first book. And that was kind of what established my reputation. So I think to get to your question, the website, bodyrecomposition.com, I probably founded or created in some form or another, I would say late 90s, thereabouts. And it's gone through, a bunch of different iterations. And I was building it for a while with a program called Freeway that was awful, and then I had someone build me one, and then about 7 or 8 years ago when I was in Salt Lake City, I finally redid it as a WordPress site and kind of themed it and built it myself. So it's, it's been around for, good God, going on 15 or 16 years now. So it's been around for a while, since back in the day when people didn't really know what these things were for. So that's probably what just a lot of it. I was telling Greg again during the intro. I would love to say I was a pioneer and jumped on the internet when it happened, but I was just in the right place at the right time. I got out of school right when it was beginning. I liked writing because I liked seeing my own words on a screen, and people seemed to respond to it, and I sort of just developed from there.
Right. Thank you for sharing that story. It's it's cool. One thing that jumped out there, I'm like, yes, we have to talk about this. Is one of your original books was about low carbohydrate dieting, cyclical dieting, and it was funny to see this come from, because last 5, 6+ years, there's so many books on low carb dieting, and invariably every single author or low carb guru is adamant about low carbs and how you have to eat low carbs because carbs release insulin, cause you to gain fat. And you were really almost very unbiased about writing a book on low carbs. You're like, you don't have to do it. So let's kind of talk about that for a second. What are your thoughts on low carbs, and why did you decide to create the cyclical diet?
Well, let's be. I didn't create anything. Low carb diets have gone in and out of phase for 100 years. Back, if you look at probably the first popular diet was the Banting diet in the 20s and 30s, and it was a obese physician, and he created this diet, and it was very low carb, very low calorie, and he lost a lot of weight, and that was kind of the first, quote unquote fad diet. And then, nutrition came around and said fat was bad in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and in the 80s we all got on the high carb, low fat train. And, Atkins came around in the 1970s with the Atkins diet, and that was kind of the second really big wave of low carbohydrate dieting. It actually led into one of my favorite diet books ever, which if you ever get the chance to read it, it's called The Drinking Man's Diet. Because, men don't diet. Certainly in the 70s, men did not diet. And so the Drinking Man's Diet was a low carb diet, but you got to drink martinis. And that was the big push for it, was that you could do the diet, but you still got to be a man and be like the guys in Mad Men TV show and drink your martinis. And alcohol was actually part and parcel of the diet, and that was very funny. In the 80s, as fat became the bad guy and fat made you fat and killed you and all that other stuff, we got into sort of what I call high carb, low fat hell. And when I was in school, certainly that was the dominant paradigm. The fat made you fat, the less fat you ate, the better. And you had a lot of people, including myself, who went to that. There was times as an endurance athlete where I was probably doing 80% carbohydrates and went from one bad extreme to one insufficient protein. You're hungry all the time, but you got a carbo load. And certainly for doing 4 to 6 hours a day of endurance training, you do need that. But for everyone else, we went from one bad extreme to another bad extreme. In the 90s, low carb kind of got repopularized. You had the EADS, protein power. You had I forget what. There's another book where you kind of, it was almost early intermittent, well, not intermittent fasting, but during the day you were low carb, and then at night you would have sort of a reward meal, and then
like the warrior diet, or
what's that?
Is that like the warrior diet?
No, this is before the warrior diet, and I'll be damned if I can remember what the name of the book was. But it was a very popular diet book, and it was like, you stay low carb during the day, but then you get that 1 hour reward meal. It was almost a prototypical, sort of an early form of intermittent fasting, but you did eat early during the day. And Ori Hofmeckler would do the warrior diet a little bit later. So in the 90s, bodybuilders were still entrenched in high carb, low fat, and it worked for some, but it didn't work for others. And that's when Dan Duchaine kind of came around. With Body Opus, Marty Pasquale had the anabolic diet, which is a very similar concept, and that's kind of when I came in. So I got involved with Body Opus that summer, and what I saw happening is when you get to low carb diets, you tend to see one of two extremes. You have low carb diets are the best, most optimal solution for every single person in humanity, and low carb diets will kill you. It was these two really radical extremes depending on the bias, and we originally set out to write, a quote unquote objective book, and that meant digging into the research.
Okay.
And that's kind of where I came in. And originally I had a co-author on that book, and another guy who was more anabolic diet oriented. He was going to do the exercise physiology, or I'm sorry, he was going to do the nutrition because he was a nutritionist. I was going to do the exercise physiology. He ended up leaving the project, and I had to do the whole thing. And the then publisher made the mistake of telling me to be thorough. And when you have some obsessive tendencies, you shouldn't say that, because you will, by the time I was digging into the 1920s research at the Vanderbilt Medical Library, things had gotten a little bit out of control. So I ended up writing this book that's 325 pages long, 600 scientific references, pretty much every study ever written on low-carb diets to about the 1996 publishing date. And it's very dry. It's a very tedious book because I was trying to be scientifically objective. And it's funny hearing people criticize me for, I'm the keto guy now. I'm the guy that Lyle only likes low-carb diets. And it's so unbearably untrue, because all throughout that book, I never once said, this is why you should do the diet. I said, you've already decided to do this diet. Here's what you need to be aware of. And it very much got misinterpreted. And even now, I take an approach, and it was funny, I was listening to the podcast you did with Dan John right before we signed on, and he and I are philosophically very, very similar. It's about using the right tool for the job. And there are times when low-carb diets are absolutely superior. There are times when they're absolutely the single worst choice. And a higher carb, lower fat diet, or a moderate carb, moderate fat diet would be a better choice. The problem is that people don't respond to that. The majority of people don't respond to that style of salesmanship. They want to hear, this is the ultimate approach. This is what we do. And unfortunately, that's what sells, and that's a marketing thing. Greg? Greg, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Sorry, your video froze up. I wasn't sure what had happened.
Oh.
So unfortunately, a lot of reality has been sublimated to marketing, because most people want to be told, this is the answer, this is the solution, this is the cure to all your woes. What's interesting is they're now finding out, and I was writing about this years ago, that one of the big benefits of low carbohydrate diets is not the low carbs, it's the higher protein. And that's really where a lot of the benefits come from. It's just when you leave people to their own devices with high carb diets, they invariably overdo carbs and they don't eat enough protein. When you make them lower their carbs and limit their food types to meat and vegetables, their protein intake goes up. They've done the studies that match protein intake. Futzing around with carbs and fats tends to not have a big difference in a controlled situation, but that's even a different issue. Most people don't live in a metabolic chamber. Most people don't live in a nutritional laboratory. Most people live in the real world. And while you or I and athletes and bodybuilders might be willing to measure and break out the measuring cups and the food scale, most people aren't going to do that. Telling them to eat less carbs and limit their foods to higher protein, higher vegetable foods, when that's all you can eat, that's all you will eat. And sort of from an ecological real world standpoint, telling people to eat lower carbs tends to force or trick them, depending on how you want to look at it, into eating more protein. And it's really the more protein that tends to have the benefit, but the end result is kind of the same. The problem is that then people hear that carbs are the enemy. It's like, no, carbs aren't the enemy. Protein is the ally, is probably the better way to look at it. So.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense for people that are not going to be, pulling out track and stuff.
Yeah, and that's the majority. And what I find, unfortunately, people tend to be there's a proximity bias. I'll measure my food or I used to when I was younger. I'd measure my food every day. You probably did it at some point too. Most people won't do that. Most people just want to be like, well, I want to go eat. Tell me what to eat. We're like, well, get a big ass chicken breast or a big ass lean steak, have a salad, done. And that will they like simple. When you're dealing with the grand majority of people, you need to give them a set of simple rules. Goes a lot further than giving them lots of math.
Right. The one thing I'll say I've found is that there are some types that don't want to weigh or measure things. They just hate that idea of that, but they'll put so much effort trying to get really, really lean, and they'll drop fat, but they'll get to this point where they're completely stuck. They're not really, like people have told me, I'm not eating that much, I barely eat any carbs, and I'm just not losing any weight. And they're like, what is going on here?
I think it's a couple things, and that has been one of my big criticisms of a lot of low-carb diet book authors, is they will say, you can eat all that you want as long as you don't eat carbs. And to a first approximation, there's some truth to that. If you're dealing with overweight individuals, people just getting started, most people will eat less, right? If carbs make up 60 to 70% of your diet, if you eat less carbs, you eat less calories. But the human body is very devious and it is smarter than we are. And eventually people start eating more without realizing it. And you can go on low-carb forums and people have made these low-carb concoctions that have just as many or more calories than the high carb. And the same thing, make no mistake, this isn't specific to low carb. When the low fat craze was going on, people heard all that matters is keeping fat low and you can eat as much as you want. Well, food companies then rushed, all these low-fat, high-carb foods that had just as many calories, and they did studies that showed that when people thought it was low-fat, they ate more. So you end up in a situation that you end up eating, at one point there were low-carb jelly beans and low-carb Oreos, and this is not what a low-carb diet, a sort of an ad libitum, eat whatever you want low-carb diet is meant to be. If you ate nothing but, leanish proteins and vegetables, you're not going to overeat. But by the time you hear that I need to add 4 tablespoons of mayonnaise and low carb cream cheese, and you're doing a blooming onion because it's low carb, and you're eating too much. And while that may not be a big deal when you're heavier, as you start to get leaner and leaner and leaner, your body figures out ways to keep you in energy balance. And that's when people, but when people have gotten the message that, oh, I don't have to count calories, getting them to recognize that they need to measure food becomes a real problem.
Right.
So I think that's a big part of what's going on. Is just people counting calories sucks. Make no mistake. Nobody enjoys it. It's not fun having to pay attention to portions. And I would love to live in a world where you could just eat, quote unquote, whatever you want and get as lean as you want to do it. But until you've had the experience, to eyeball your food intake, and top bodybuilders and physique athletes can do this. They don't count stuff, but after you've been doing it for a decade, they know where to cut things. They know to cut their rice by half a cup or whatever it is. Most people don't. And their first contest, they get to that point, like you said, where they're 10%, they're like, I'm stuck. And I go, and they'll give you every detail. They'll come on my forum and give you a list of, I'm this and I'm clean, I'm that and the other. And my first question is, how much are you eating? And they don't know that question. They don't know the answer to the one question that actually matters. And that's invariably, there can be other weirdness, there can be some water retention issues, there can be weird stuff going on. But in the grand majority of cases, they're eating more than they think, or they're not counting. You hear it all the time. I don't eat that much. Well, write down what you eat, and it's invariably way more than they think it is.
Right, and that's kind of funny. It's like you put in all this work, you've gone to this point, and you've been spinning your wheels for how many months? It's like eventually you're going to have to track things maybe for a month.
Yeah.
Dial things in, but
and I put that in most of my books. And one of these days when I ever write like a general fat loss book instead of specific diets, like that is the worst part of reprogramming your eating habits. Is for 2 or 3 weeks you need to measure everything, because especially in the U.S. when this is a portion. The food portions have been going up and up and up. People have no clue how much food they're actually supposed to be eating in a day. And you can go get a single meal at a lot of restaurants that is your daily food intake. And unfortunately, when you then show people what a reasonable sized meal is, it's really depressing. It's really not an amount, but they don't know what 4 ounces of chicken breast is. They don't know what a cup of rice is. They hear that rice is good, and that's a cup of rice, right? And whoops, my camera, that's a cup of rice, and they're having a bowl this big, and I'm like, that's 800 calories. That is over and especially if you're a smaller female or a smaller male, like that is over 1/3 of what you're supposed to be, or less. And I also, kind of getting off topic, lighter dieters, lighter males, and especially lighter females, when they realize how little they're going to have to eat to get contest lean, it's just depressing as hell. When you are a 120-pound female, and you're going to have to be at 8 to 10 calories a pound to get contest, that's 1,200 calories a day. That's 3 or 4 micro meals. Like, that is not a lot of food, and it's really, 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 really frustrating. But you do have to, when you get people to measure, and they start to realize that, that deck of cards, that's 4 ounces of chicken. Well, this is what you're getting at the restaurant is 3 of those. And they've lost the concept of what true food intake is. And the only way to fix it is to sit down and break out the measuring cups and break out the scale and do it for 2 or 3 weeks. And folks that have been doing that for years, I can look at a meal, and you can probably do it too, and pretty much know how many calories is in it. But most people are going to have to spend 3 weeks doing, and it sucks, but it has to get done.
Right, okay. And it's funny. It's cool. What I've noticed is when you start tracking these foods, you're like, holy crap, this is a cup of rice.
Yeah.
This tiny little trivial amount. You start to be like, you know what? I'm gonna eat potatoes instead because Because
No, that's very true. That and they've done they've done diets around satiety index, and energy density, and picking high foods that give you a lot of volume with fewer calories. And going back to your question about low carb diets, that is another potential advantage. It's really easy to overeat carbs, especially any sort of concentrated. I hate to use the word refined, but the more as you get into grains and breads and stuff, 200 calories of rice is nothing. 200 calories of potato is a lot of food, and 200 calories of vegetables is an enormous amount of food. And certainly when you limit those easy to overeat foods, again, people tend to automatically eat less. And that is another, and they stay fuller longer. The higher protein, moderate fat, more fruits and vegetables. Like I did that too. When I was an endurance athlete, like if I get to eat bread, that's all I'll eat. When I don't get to eat bread, I'll eat vegetables. And it's tough to find that balance to do both at all times, to get your lean protein, to get your vegetables, and then you add starch on top of that. But endurance athletes tend to just do rice and pasta and bread and bagels and then throw a little protein on top and no fat because fat is bad. So yeah, that's when you get into that too, you're right. You do start to realize, man, if I'm going to be dieting, I better pick foods that are going to keep me full and actually take more than 30 seconds to eat. Because a lot of those concentrated foods, they don't take any time at all.
Right. And earlier you mentioned how the high carb approach, it would work for some people.
Yes.
And it's almost like when you're showcasing an alternative, as far as using low carbs in a sensible manner. I guess that fills in the gaps for the people that don't do well on the high carb approach. And why are there these differences? Why is it that some people, they thrive on low carbs and other people want to shoot themselves? Me, like using just me as an illustration, I did a lot of low carb diet in the past, and I was able to tolerate it. But like I couldn't sleep at night. Sex drive was down. My serotonin, literally, I had like no sense of humor anymore. So I mean, like, what do you think these differences come down to?
I think there's a lot of different stuff going on. One is, and this was something, when the high carb fad really took off, it was all these studies that were looking at endurance athletes and going, you need 60% carbs and 10 grams per kilo and all this. And it's like, yeah, when you're doing, 2 to 6 hours of training a day, you absolutely do need those carbs to sustain performance. Most of us sit on our butts all day, right? And that also gets back to your question about people getting stuck, is people's activity levels are a lot lower than they used to be. And because of that, you have to cut calories harder, especially as you get contest lean. So you got that. One is just a sheer activity level. If you're doing a lot of activity, you can handle more carbs. If you're doing less activity, you need less carbs. And I remember an argument that I got into with someone years and years and years ago. He was very anti-low carb. And my point was, look, if you're not doing a lot of activity by choice or by design, if you're heavier, if you're not active, I would love for people to do an hour, but they're not going to, and you should lower your carbs. His argument was, well, they should just do more activity. I don't disagree with a fundamental principle, but that doesn't mean that they're going to do it, right? As Dan Duchesne once put it, good advice not followed is still bad advice. And he was working the standpoint of, well, if they won't do more exercise, they should just do more exercise. It's like, I work the standpoint of, if they're not going to do more exercise, let's adjust the diet to what they are going to do, because both ways can work in the short term. So that's part of it, is activity level. There's an insulin sensitivity issue, and insulin sensitivity refers to how well or how poorly your tissues respond to insulin. In general, people with better insulin sensitivity do better on higher carbs, and vice versa. Now, insulin sensitivity, activity again, but there's a big genetic component. Some people, no matter what they do, no matter how lean they are, no matter how much activity they do, they just don't have good insulin sensitivity. They tend to find that they feel very sleepy and dopey after high carb diets. They don't get a good pump. They get flat and puffy. People with high insulin sensitivity, they eat carbs and they just look full and lean, and their muscles pump up and they feel energetic. And that's both a genetic and environmental standpoint. There is a brain aspect of it. Some people, you mentioned serotonin. Some people, when they go on low carbs, they get clinically depressed. And that's a real problem, because that's not really conducive to sticking with a diet.
Yeah, I was borderline, I think. I was borderline.
Yeah, it's awful. It's just awful. And that's a very individual type of thing. And unfortunately right now, the best you can kind of do is, well, try it, and if you get depressed, don't do it. And that's not really very useful, but it's kind of all we've got right now. But some people, they don't feel good. There's another issue, and this is again, there are individual differences, although I see bigger differences in women than in men. Men tend to be a little bit, just women have we've got an additional aspect of menstrual cycle, which is another big thing. But there's just all these individual differences that low carbs do work better. There's even one weird little study that tied it into something called the FOX gene, which has something to do with metabolism, and it was never replicated, but people with a certain FOX gene variation lost a ton more weight on low carbs, and people with the other one lost a ton more weight on high carbs. And they don't really know why, but we're getting into the nutrigenomic aspect where your genetic basis and mine, whether it's due to ethnic background or whatever, you're going to respond to certain foods differently than I am. I mean, they've even shown, the Alaskan Inuit, they handle dietary fat differently than the non-Inuit, and it's because they evolved in a situation where they were eating whale blubber, and their bodies do handle it differently. If you look at cultures that grew up on grains and rice and all of that, they tend to handle those carbs a lot better. You see the same thing with alcohol. Have you ever noticed how Irish and Russian folks can drink and drink and drink? That's because they evolved as drinkers. Like, they have spent generations drinking like fish, and their livers and their bodies actually metabolize alcohol in like a fundamentally different way. Whereas you've got Native Americans and the Japanese, they have a liver, you give them alcohol and it blows them up. There's a huge genetic component, and that applies to diet as well.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, but I was going to say is, but that's unfortunately one thing that I find, and this is true of all aspects of training, diet, nutrition, is people tend to assume that what works for them is what works for everyone. Whenever you see someone that goes, low-carb diets are the best, it's because it works for them. They say low-carb diets suck, it's because it didn't work for them. They haven't worked with enough people to see the variation. And same thing for high carbs, same thing for exercise selection. We may talk about that in a bit. But if someone says squats are the best exercise ever, their levers are good for squatting. And if someone says squats suck, they're very tall with long legs, and squats are a bad exercise for them. But it's not looking at what the potential objective pros and cons are for an individual. It's, well, this is what works for me, and I'm the center of the universe, ergo it will work for everyone. And that's an unfortunate, it's a part of how the human brain is biased, actually. But that's a big part of, I think, why people tend to sell things so hard. It's what worked for them, ergo it must work for everyone. Right.
And like, maybe to some degree, just by selling other people on it, it makes their belief stronger for themselves.
No, absolutely. That's a big part of, once you identify as a low carb person, it's, you become very much a zealot to sell it. And of course, then there's commercial aspects, and invariably people tend to sell whatever is the opposite of what's popular, because people tend to fall into if this is what everybody's doing, and that's the sales pitch. It's like, what if everything you've ever been told was wrong? That's a very common sales pitch. So if they're pushing high carbs in the mainstream nutrition, low carbs will be popular. And if the U.S. dietary folks ever push low carb diets, I guarantee you would see books going, what if they're still lying to you? What if high carbs are and people do. People want the answer. People want a singular answer because it's simpler to talk about.
Keys. And so I was just gonna say, Lyle, like, really, what boggles my mind is how more people don't come down to this conclusion as far as dropping body fat. Is like for me, it's like the simple question is, what's the most enjoyable way for me to consistently eat a deficit? And for
and that's absolutely, people have asked me for over a decade, what's the best diet? And I'll tell them it's the one you'll stick to, because certainly when you get to contest levels and you're looking at very low percentage body fats, they're detailed. But for most people who are just getting started, the best diet is the one that they'll do. Because all of these details, all this stuff about protein intake and percentages and all this other nonsense really doesn't matter when you're just getting started. It's the one that you'll stick. Consistency trumps anything else. It's true of training, and I'm sure other people you've done the podcast with, I know Dan John has said this. There's a lot of different ways to reach a goal. And as long as you hit some basic requirements, the details kind of don't matter. And a lot of it is, something that, I know we're going to get into this. To me, the big question is not how to get people to lose fat or lose weight. We've known that for 40 years. We've known that for longer than that. Everyone knows what to do. To me, the more interesting question is, why are people so bad at it? Why are people not able to do what they need to do for more than 3 to 6 weeks? To me, it's and I know this is a big part of your focus, is It's the psychological aspect. It's the adherence issue. It's the why will people not follow an exercise program for more than 3 weeks? Why will they not stick with the diet in the long term? And there's some aspect, and it's not just specific to diet or training. Look at how most behavior changes fail. Quitting smoking, quitting drinking, gambling, I mean, whatever it is, and certainly some things are more addictive or more potentially hard to quit than others. But why are humans so damn bad at changing their behaviors in the long term? And you answer that because my gut says that there's a general aspect of the human brain. There's something about human behavior that is a commonality. Solve that, and you solve all these other problems because you find a way to get people to adhere to the changes long enough for them to stick. But figuring that out, you know, if I see another study where they compare high fiber to low fiber, this, you know what, we've done this work. We've known this for years, what to do. Parsing out whether one specific diet is better than the other is no longer the valid question. The question is, how do we get people to do it? How do we get the majority, not the 5 or 10% that are driven and athletes and psychotic, not them. How do we get the majority to make long-term behavior changes and stick with it? Because so far, every public policy change, every attempt to do this has failed completely. I remember in the 90s when the goal was Healthy People 2000, American College of Sports Medicine. Let's get people doing an hour of vigorous exercise, whatever, 3 to 5 days a week. That became Healthy People 2010. Let's get people to do 45 minutes 4 times a week. That became, and they just kept dropping the bar, and they still can't get people to do it. And there's some fundamental aspect of humans that makes this impossible to get done, and I don't know what it is.
You know, chills are going down my throat because that is just so crystal clear. So many people have just been trying to figure out the wrong, they've been asking the wrong questions, trying to figure out the wrong problem. We know how to lose weight, we know how to build muscle. Yeah.
Right. Why won't people do it? I mean, and in that sense, it's, you know, maybe worth looking at some of the systems that do appear to be successful, you know, and invariably they do have certain commonalities, and we're still working a lot of this out. But, you know, as much as Weight Watchers tend to get crapped on as a group, they actually do a pretty. I've kept up a little bit just because I know people that have done it. They're actually doing a lot of things right. You know, they give people weekly goals, they give people accountability, they give people little tokens as rewards, they give people a system that's usable but works. Is it the best system in the world? No, and athletes and bodybuilders, you know, they're the ones that get really pissy with it. But again, that's proximity bias. It's not for them. Weight Watchers is not for people trying to get contest lean. But that 5% of the population, they have more interesting questions. You know, getting someone to contest lean without muscle loss, fascinating question. What is it, 1/10 of 1%? 1% of the population. But it's an irrelevant population. It's like a coach who only cares about how do we get a guy to beat Usain Bolt. Fantastic. He's got 10 guys to work with. It's a fascinating question, but it's not relevant. Weight Watchers, those big groups that are targeting things, they're doing a lot of things right. And invariably, they're looking at ways of addressing behavior change. You know, even the addiction groups, they do a lot of very similar things. And somewhere I've got a book that talks about long-term behavior change, and it had like there's different ways of approaching it. And you know, if say you're an ex-alcoholic, the easiest solution is don't be around it, right? It's just damage control. If you know that going into a bar is a trigger for you, just don't go into a bar. And most alcoholics will tell you that they cannot be in that environment. And there's different levels of that depending on what you're looking at. One difficulty with changing eating behavior compared to addiction, right? If you're a heroin addict or a drug addict, in premise, the concept of don't keep drugs in the house is fundamentally very easy. I mean, again, in premise, probably not in practice, but whatever. You can't escape food in our society. There's unless you live as a hermit in your house, and there's actually some work that suggests that people that are more like that do what bodybuilders do and just don't leave the house and live this very Spartan lifestyle. Like you are bombarded every day by enormous cues to overconsume food, junk food commercials, billboards, everywhere you go. Drugs, almost at a fundamental level, are easier to avoid. Alcohol is easier to avoid, maybe a little bit harder, but it's easier to just not be in environments where people are doing cocaine. Where are you going to go where people aren't eating? Changing dietary behaviors is almost going to be harder than some of these others, simply because our environment is so overwhelmingly conducive to consumption of that food. Activity is the same way. people, they've been throwing out ideas for years of how to make urban sprawl more activity friendly. Because while it's great to think people are going to go to the gym, look at the day, your daily life, you've got family, you've got work, you've got all these obligations. Getting people to go take 2 hours to drive to the gym, dress out, work is unrealistic. If you can get them to even do 30 minutes of activity because they're walking to work, that would be great. But how are you going to do it? The way America especially has grown up as a country, I live in Austin, Texas. You don't walk anywhere here. You can't do it. The sidewalks just end. Like, it is not, unless you live downtown, it is not conducive to any sort of daily activity. In the New England area, New York, those areas, there is more of that. But as the U.S. spread west and south, everything grew up as urban sprawl. We are all driving cities. Over in Europe, certainly they still have a culture of bike riding and walking and doing things like that we don't. But this idea that we can completely retool our urban environment to get people to get activity on a day-to-day basis, while wonderful and utopian, is never going to happen because it would take billions, and people still probably wouldn't take advantage of it. So figuring out a way to get people to do that on a day-to-day basis. And also, again, dealing with the food, and they've tried. They're like, we're going to, tax fast food. We're going to make it more difficult. People are still going to eat it. I've had people argue with me that, if they just had access to better nutritious food at the same price, they'd eat it. And no, they wouldn't, because sugar and saturated fat taste better than vegetables. That's just truth. I wish it were different, but it's not. Wishing won't make it true. So we're kind of in that situation that makes it, very, very difficult. Go ahead.
And right there is essentially the entire problem. When you talk to, a friend or someone, they said, if it was the same price for healthy food, I would do it. That's the story they're telling themselves to justify why they're fat, which in essence is the reason why they're still fat, because they're not willing to take any responsibility. They're just going to scapegoats.
Yeah, no, I agree, and America especially. I can't do this right now. We've created a culture of it's somebody else's problem, and everything is someone else's fault, and we're fat because McDonald's has fast food. It's a really weird culture. Give me 1 second. I need to. And yeah, that is, and that. Maybe that's to the point. If you look at, like, say, Alcoholics Anonymous, and I know not everyone is a fan of that group, and they've got their problems, but step one is taking responsibility. It is admitting that you have a problem. Because without that, nothing ever changes until you come to terms with the fact that, and there are situations where that's not the case. I've heard people, they're at university and they don't have a lot of money. They live at home, they can't control their food. If you're in the military, fine, but they're not overfeeding you anyway. But at a fundamental level, guess what? You know who's responsible for what goes in your face? You are. I've joked about writing a self-help book. And chapter 1 is going to be, you are the source of all your problems. If you want to know what's wrong with your life on a day-to-day basis, go look in the mirror. And that's harsh, but it's true. Is you are the one making the same poor choices day to day to day, and we can make excuses for it and justifications for it, but that's all it is at the end of the day. But getting people to take that responsibility in a culture that says it's not your responsibility is very, very, very difficult. And certainly there's a percentage that does it, and they're the ones that succeed, and they think it's easy and everyone should be able to do it. But clearly it's not, because if it were easy to do it, everyone would do it.
Right, and as we were discussing why behavioral change is so hard, it just kind of brought up, just looking at like the people that I see succeed the most on a diet, and comparing that with the people that fail every single year, and usually there's drastic differences in their outlook and their mindset.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's been an area that, finally researchers, going back to this asking the wrong question, they have started to look, what are commonalities between successful weight losers and unsuccessful weight losers, and there tends to be, a large group of them, but there are always commonalities. And, one thing I know you wanted to bring up, and I'll just go ahead and give you the transition. One of them is this concept of rigid versus flexible dieting, and which is one of many. There's a lot of other habits that people engage in, and there's some work, and I forget the psychologist's name, but some of it is being goal versus process oriented. That's, maybe we can address that first. Is a lot of people, they focus on the goal. I want to lose weight now, and I have a fundamental premise that no matter how quickly you're losing weight, you always want it to be twice as fast. If you're losing a pound a week, you want it to be 2. If you're losing 2 pounds a week, you want it to be 4. I get someone losing 10 pounds a week, and they'd be like, "Damn it, I should be losing more. And shows like The Biggest Loser don't help with this concept because they take people and cheat and go, you can lose 30 pounds in a week. And it gives them, it's like the bodybuilding ads of gain 40 pounds in a month. And you tell people, try 2. Like, well, I don't want that. That's not acceptable to me. People want it now. But you've got that aspect that it's never fat. But if you focus on the process, I remember years ago I read a little article in some personal trainer magazine, and they said when people focus on weight loss alone, they fail because it's never fast enough, it's never good enough. Because if they focus on improving their fitness, they always lose weight. Because if you're just focusing on getting fitter, pushing yourself, focusing on the process, usually the goal will happen. And there's pros and cons of both. Very goal-driven people tend to do well in the short term, in my experience, and often do well in the long term. But a lot of people, you know, as I've written, when you're on the diet, you're on the diet. And when you're off the diet, you're off the diet. And there's no middle ground because they're either down 50 pounds or they yo-yo back and forth because it's one extreme to the other. The other people who tend to find more flexibility and find, you know, make it a lifestyle or whatever, and one can certainly transition the other, but they do better in the long term. That's a harder sell though, you know. And even, I mean, I've got my own rapid fat loss handbook, gotten some criticism for it. I went from the approach of you're going to do it. There's reasons where it's beneficial, and there's actually research coming out that losing weight faster initially has better long-term results if you do it properly, which means you eat whole food, you exercise, you do things like that. If you do liquid diets, stuff that doesn't retrain eating habits, it doesn't work. But people want quick results. But sometimes giving them quick results in the short term gets them to stick with it past that sticking point. There's that 3 to 6 week mark where people get frustrated. Because if you're 100 pounds overweight and I tell you you're going to lose 2 pounds a week, screw it. I'm not taking a year. Screw this. If I can take 10 pounds off of you in a week, even if some of it's a lot of it's water, that has adherence benefits because you're getting that positive reinforcement, positive reward. It's almost like training a dog. But it does work. People like to see quick results. If that gets them to stick with it longer, that can be beneficial as well. So you've got that aspect of it, but you've also got this rigid versus flexible dieting thing. And it's true of a lot of behaviors. And again, you know, if you're looking at drug addiction, you can't eat a little heroin or take a little heroin. You know, telling someone just have a little bit tends not to work. But again, with food, you're dealing with a very different issue. I find that when even I knew this before I wrote that book, you know, my guide to flexible dieting was whenever you are absolutist when you tell someone you can never eat something again, that's all they want to eat. And there's tons of studies showing that the more restrictive you are, the more food cravings you have, without fail. When you find ways to include those foods in your diet and get out of this good food, bad food mentality, it changes the psychology of it. It removes that, you know, to delve into pop psychology, you get out of the shame cycle. I ate a cookie. Well, I'm a loser. I'm a failure. I failed my diet. Dude, you had 100 calories. Get over it. No, I'm a failure. I might as well eat the whole bag. Well, no, 100 calories didn't break your diet, but the 1,000 you just ate did. Now you've blown it. Right now because you chose to, because you put yourself, but that got promoted a lot, and you know, you get a lot of the physique, sports, bodybuilding, fitness figure, a lot of them, it's subclinical eating disorders. It's a way of taking a control point on your food and channeling it into something healthier because, you know, they are fit and all that other stuff, but it can be just as damaging. You know, I've heard stories of female competitors that if they have a creamer in their coffee, well, I've blown my diet. I may as well go eat 4 blizzards, and they do. They go eat themselves sick, sneaking away to eat their chicken breast and broccoli in the bathroom because they don't get a food break. It becomes so pathological at that level. You know, so we've got the two extremes. We've got the just eat whatever you want, eat McDonald's and fries and don't give a crap. You know, the fat acceptance stuff. We've got the if you're not clean 100%, you're a failure as a human being. There's a happy medium. And finding that is a lot of where that flexible dieting concept comes in, is recognizing that, look, within reason, a little bit of junk isn't going to break your diet. In fact, it'll probably make it work better. And that was, you know, when I came across that research, that was a big sort of an eye-opener for me, this premise that, look, not only will it not break your diet, but if knowing a couple times a week you can have that, you know, I hate to use treat or bad food or whatever, but have something that's not strictly in your diet, that's a psychological release. Because if I tell you you can never have a cookie again, it's all you want. You know, the pink elephant syndrome. If I tell you you can have it in controlled numbers or once or twice a week, you're like, okay, cool, I can diet for 3 or 4 days. And I think that's a lot of why those cyclical low-carb diets worked. Part of it was a big adherence issue. outside of any physiological stuff. If you just got someone who overeats carbs, we just take them out. They're deal breaker foods, diet breaker foods. But once a day, once a week, you get to eat whatever you want. Suddenly you're like, I can do this for 6 days. I can eat protein and fat and all this other stuff because I get to have my bagels and pancakes. And it invariably breaks that psychological cycle. For the next 16 weeks, I never get to eat anything I want. And that is such a psychological, release on the diet cycle. Now you have to find, the problem comes in that people then go to that other extreme. Well, if I get to have a cookie once a week, well, how about twice a week? How about twice a day? How about, give them an inch, you take a mile. Some people can do it intuitively, and when I wrote that guide to flexible dieting, I called it controlled flexible dieting, which is a little bit of a contradiction, but I would love people to be able to easily just have a little bit of forbidden foods or whatever you want to look at it each day, but a lot of people can't do that. And you do have to put some control points in, sort of this middle range between never eat it a little bit every day. It's like, okay, you get it once a week or a couple times a week. I tell people, go to a restaurant. Don't go to a buffet, because if you get it at home, you're going to eat it all. If you buy that cake, you're not going to stop at a slice. If you go to a restaurant, you'll feel bad about ordering a second slice of cake. And that acts as kind of a controller. It's sort of a super, a super ego on your id. So it was almost a control to get people as a transition point between the rigidity and the ideal flexible dieting, where you can have a little bit every day.
That is a beautiful point. I can totally relate that to myself. It's going out to restaurants. For me, it's like Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever. There's some cake. It's so hard to stop at that one slice. But if you're at a restaurant, you don't have.
You're just not going to do it.
Yeah.
And I definitely tell people, don't go to a buffet, don't go to Golden Corral, don't go to the China buffet, because suddenly you can crush it in an hour. And this diet that I can't remember the name of, they said eat low carb during the day, then eat all you want at night. But here were the rules. You had 1 hour. You had to start with a salad. Then you had to eat some protein. Now, by the time you've done that, you're going to be full. Mm-hmm. So even if you tack on that treat at the end, you feel like you're eating whatever you want, but you're not. They built a control system in without telling you were dieting, and even that has a psychological benefit. This goes back to your question about why low-carb diets often work for people. Some people will say the best diet is the one that you don't know that you're on, and they've tried to find a lot of strategies. There's a book called Mindless Eating, and they've done a ton of research on weird little things that make people eat more. And if you find ways to get people to eat less without thinking they're dieting, that's fantastic, because you've done this too. If I know Monday I have to be on a diet, I'm already stressed. I'm already like, man, I'm going to be deprived. I'm going to go eat crap today because I'm starting my diet tomorrow. If I've given you a set of rules that's going to magically make you eat less but not think you're dieting, you remove that psychological stress. That's great, but again, you get to a point where that stops working and you have to start counting. So there's a happy medium to be had. It's different, and it all depends on what your entry point is. If I've got someone who's significantly overweight who just needs to get started, I'm not giving them a diet. I'm giving them a couple of key points that'll magically reduce their food intake, and they'll lose weight without even thinking about it. I had a guy years ago, and he was drinking 4 Dr. Peppers a day. And I said, just switch to diet. It was the only change I wanted him to make. But that was like 1,000 calories a day. He started losing 2 pounds a week with it. I looked for small qualitative changes to get them started. When they get to higher levels, then you go to more quantitative. You need to start tracking calories when things stop working. What I find with a lot of people that come from that 6 meals a day, everything measured, they take a beginner and go, okay, you're going to have to eat every 3 hours, 3 ounces of lean protein, this and that and the other. And if you're a beginner, you're like, screw this. This isn't worth it to me. They really don't realize that where they're at 10 years down the road, they forget when they were a beginner, or they forget that they're inherently psychotic and they're not the majority, and they forget that they're not their customers or they're not their clients.
There are so many points that I just want to which one do I go with? But
yeah, okay, sorry.
First thing I'll say is that reminds me, when recently my uncle was over at dinner and he had this big tall glass of some juice, pineapple juice, cranberry juice. She was like, Greg, so how should I start losing weight? I'm like, well, first step is stop drinking 400 calories of juice with dinner.
Yes.
Bottom line. And funny enough, drinking juice with dinner just tends to make you eat more.
Yes.
So I don't even understand that. And then we're talking about flexible eating and, fitting in, those foods into your diet. And so funny enough, when I first started kind of getting into this a few years ago, I felt real, because most people feel guilty having a cookie. If I have my macros and my calories laid out, and I fit in cookies or a bit of ice cream into the numbers, I feel amazing. I'm like, yes, I'm getting ripped and I'm eating cookies. This is incredible.
Right. But that's that concept issue. That's something that you only get to after a while. Getting people out of, because they're bombarded by all this. These are, I mean, look at it. We call them junk foods. They're bad foods. They're good foods. People are made to feel very guilty for eating these things, and it's like, no, it's just food. It's just, and then of course, you get into this. We've got flexible dieting, which has bred if it fits your macros. IFYM, which is kind of the new big acronym, and again. 15 years ago, I asserted on one of the news groups, I said, I believe that if you got sufficient protein, you could eat nothing but table sugar for carbs and get ripped. And everyone thought that I was out of my mind. And there's been at least 1 or 2 studies that actually, sometimes table sugar almost works better than other carbs for a number of different reasons. But it really does come down to calorie control. Now, sure, you're not going to be able to control your food intake eating table sugar. It's not filling, it's not satiating. But what's happened with the if it fits your macros thing is you've got people almost seeing how far they can push it. And I saw this with Body Opus. I saw this with the ketogenic diets. They're like 5,000 calories on carb load, 6,000, 7. Who could push it? Because that's just a human nature to go to the extreme. But now you've got people criticizing if it fits your macros. Well, all you're eating is Pop-Tarts all day. No. You've got a couple people that are doing it to make a point. But for most people, you do this, I do this. My diet, in as much as I have one, it's probably 80% clean or traditional or whatever. I'm not eating like that at every meal. I'm not even eating like that at every day. But the fact that I can do it every once in a while, I had a teammate when I was in Salt Lake City, and we'd go to the China buffet on Saturday training, and I would kill it. It's like, how do you stay so light eating like that? I go, I don't do it every day. This is a once-a-week treat when we go out as a team. We just trained our butts off for 2.5 hours, and I want to eat because I like bulk sushi. But it wasn't an everyday thing for me. But people have gotten this idea that, well, if you're just it's that silly ass argument of, well, if you're going to eat one Pop-Tart, well, why not eat all the Pop-Tarts? Well, that's a logical fallacy called excluding the middle. That's a stupid way to argue. You're arguing against something that I'm not saying. I'm not, and
yeah.
But you see that, I'm seeing that a lot. That's the current backlash, because any idea that's generated, first it goes to one extreme. You get the guys that they're cutting on nothing but Pop-Tarts and ice cream, and they're getting just as contest lean. And then you get the other backlash, well, that's all it is. Or I've seen people go, so do I have to eat Pop-Tarts if I'm flexible dieting? Well, of course not. Mm-hmm. An option is not a requirement. Like those are different words. Saying that you can does not mean that you have to. It's just that you have the possibility of within your nutrient intake. If you want to do that, you can. But no, you don't have to eat Pop-Tarts. That's a ridiculously. But that's the message people have gotten. Mm-hmm. In the same way that in the 80s, what was said was excess dietary fat tends to make you, that way they thought it would make you, but it does. It's more calories. If you reduce dietary fat, you will tend to lose weight. What people heard was, as long as I don't eat dietary fat, I can eat whatever I want. The message got garbled down the road. And flexible dieting, if it fits your macros, that's very much happening. The idea that you can include those foods has turned into you must include those foods, has turned into, well, that's all you're eating. No. That is not what anybody is saying, even if a handful of people are doing it to be ridiculous. But that's because the internet is ridiculous. So.
Yeah, and it's an interesting phenomenon. Sometimes if someone switches from the very controlled, obsessive approach of just eating quote-unquote clean foods to having the freedom to eat the stuff they want, a lot of times when normally they'd have that craving, they're like, well, actually, I could take it or leave it.
Yes, exactly.
It's a very much so. Interesting phenomenon.
But again, that's that psychology. You want what you can't have. If I tell you can't have something, you're going to want it. If I tell you can have it, you might not. But knowing that you can suddenly makes it no longer. I mean, it's a random story. I had a teammate, and he was after this little 21-year-old girl, and her parents made the mistake of telling her, he's a really good guy for you. And that soured it. What they should have told her was, don't date that boy. You always want what you can't have. And by doing that, that's what works. And it's the same thing in food. Is if I tell you you can't have a donut, that's all you want. If I go, you can eat it, you might not. You like what you said. You might take it or leave it. So it really does. And that's probably the biggest, it's probably my least well-selling book, The Guide to Flexible Dieting. And I wish more, because it's not catchy, the title is bad, it's not a diet. It's the one I wish more people would read, because the people who were on that 6 days a week, clean, guilt, they're just like, this conceptually changed my life. It made it so that I could, it breaks what is almost a subclinical eating disorder by allowing them to eat stuff without feeling like they're a failure as a person, and they still get to their goals.
Mm-hmm. And it's probably, I'd be curious, like, I feel like, the big crowd that's very clean eating, this and that, but they'll do that one day cheat day. Well, they could probably spread that 1 day of gargantuan eating across 7 days and make it flexible dieting and end up like eating less junk.
Yes. No. Exactly. Yeah, it's absolutely true. At least when folks get to that, you do see in the short term, and I've seen this with intermittent fasting. Initially, when you give people that flexibility, they tend to go a little bit berserk. Certainly, when I did my early body opus carb loads, it was like, oh man, I got real sloppy with it, and I'm like, it stopped being a carb load and started being a crap load, and I'm just like, 12 donuts because I can, and then that gets boring after a while because you start feeling very bad when you do that, and you pull it back and you feel like, okay, happy medium. If I want to go have a couple donuts and that's my carbs for the day, I'll do that one meal a week, or whatever your particular. But by doing that, you're not mental over the idea that, God, that's all I want right now. And you're right, you do, after the initial thrill wears off of being able to eat whatever you want, you tend to pull things back because you get tired of feeling just full and sick and kind of awful. So
yeah, exactly. And that's like the connection that some people make is they'll assume that they feel like crap eating cookies or eating carbs, but it's just they took it to the extreme. If they had a moderate amount, they would have been feeling probably better than ever, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've actually seen some coaches use that as a trick to get people to not flexible diet. They're like, all right, we're gonna make you eat strict for 13 days, and then for a day, put as much crap down your throat, and all you do is like, I feel terrible. He's right. Junk food is bad for you, and it's toxic, and it's poisonous, and it's such utter BS. It's such an awful way to do things because it doesn't. Again, the goal is not to eat as much as you can. The goal is to have the ability to eat what you want, at least within limits. But people mishear that. They hear, I'm supposed to go eat to put as much food down my throat as I can, and as much junk. And that's why I try to get away from calling it cheat days, and I prefer to call it a free day or a free meal. Cheat has a negative connotation, and whenever you tell people to have a cheat meal, they will go consciously or subconsciously out of their way to eat as much crap as they can. Mm-hmm. I'm cheating. I'm supposed to do the bad stuff. Like, no, this is a free meal. It is a meal that you can eat within limits. Have something that's not on your diet. Get it out of your system. It won't kill you. If it's high sodium, your weight will spike tomorrow. Get over it. Stay off the scale. Whatever it is. I prefer. That's why words do very much affect how we conceptualize things. And cheat meal is very different than a free meal for most people. And I've tried to get people out of that for the longest time.
Right. And the next thing
no avail, but yeah, I tried.
No, to no avail. The next thing I wanted to talk about was you mentioning being goal-oriented versus being process-oriented, and then you kind of related that to muscle building. You're not going to gain 20 pounds of muscle in a month. You'll gain 2 pounds. And so that's why it makes sense, instead of focusing on how fast you're building muscle, focus on the gears that push that drive that muscle, on getting stronger. And this brings me to my point with you, is when I first started immersing myself in some of your work, you kind of beautifully laid out the importance as a natural lifter with adding more weight to the bar. That's the way you're going to grow, because a lot of what I read at the time was pushing this idea of very high volume, and I did that for a while.
We all did.
Stronger. I got some good gains for 2 weeks, and then plateau.
Yep. And all of that, the bodybuilding arena and sports in general, people don't want to talk about it or think about it or hear about it. But since about the 60s or 70s, drugs have been a huge part of that subculture. And as much as people want to say drugs don't do the work, and they don't, there's been studies that steroids by themselves, in even moderate doses, will put more muscle on you than training. Training plus steroids works better. But the fact is, if I give someone enough testosterone, they will gain more muscle in 12 weeks than someone training their butt off 4 times a week. And that is really so you had all this stuff in the 70s when drug doses were even very, very low. You look at the stuff that those guys took, and it was a very moderate dose. It still was allowing them to do things. It made the training not matter. It made dieting almost not matter. I remember, you're probably too young to remember this, there was a brief attempt to create a natural professional bodybuilding organization. It was the WBF, the WBB. And it was actually run by Vince McMahon, who ran pro wrestling. And he wanted to take it out of the IFBB's hands and make this thing where everyone had a character and a costume, very pro wrestling approach. And they decided to drug test. And at the first contest, everyone looked terrible. Nobody could get into shape. And I remember Dan Duchesne again, because he came through that whole time. He's like, that made him really realize how many mistakes drugs were covering up for. By the time you're taking anabolics, Clen, thyroid, GH at the time was too expensive, even the basic drugs, the dieting almost doesn't matter. The training almost doesn't matter. I had a pro tell me one time, forget special diets. Take as many drugs as you can afford and starve for as long as you can take it. And that's how professional bodybuilders diet. They take appetite suppressants, Clen, thyroid, GH, insulin, anabolic steroids, now we're into peptides, IGF-1, prostaglandins, and Lord knows what. That makes the training almost not matter. And there's pictures of some guys, some ex-pros that have gone off their drugs. They're 80 pounds lighter. Like they look like every other person on the street. They don't even look like they've ever trained in their life because it was all the drugs doing all the work. Now, make no mistake, there were guys like Dorian. There have been, Ronnie Coleman is strong as hell. There are guys that are strong as well who've gotten away from that. But in the 70s, it was just like volume, 20 sets, once a week, blast it, burn it, blitz it, etc., and take enough drugs that it didn't matter. We're coming back to where you don't see quite so much of that. But naturals only have a limit to what they can recover from. And even in other sports, in the 80s, the Germans and the Soviets came along, and training volumes went through the roof. They went from 1 training session a day to 3. Volumes went up, and it was right in line with drug use. They were taking 10,000 athletes, drugging the crap out of them, giving them all the training, and the 10 that survived were world beaters. There are world records from the 1980 track and field events. The German women still hold those world records. Now, name me a sport where there's a 30-year-old world record still, and it's because those women had more testosterone than any man does today. Those records will never be beaten because the drug use was it was systematic, it was excessive, it was just phenomenal. And all that, what's funny is if you got coaches, Brian Haycock, Borg Fagerly, even Dante Trudell, Dog Crap, you've got guys that are working with drug using, that are supplemented, that are taking drugs, and they still grow better with more reasonable training approaches. Like you can get away with high volume with enough drugs, but you still do better training intelligently. And whenever they move those guys to more moderate approaches, the drugs can only make you recover from so much. And guys are like, I'm gonna go on drugs and triple my volume. No, go on drugs and add 20% to your volume, and you'll grow like a weed. Or find the volume you can handle, and now add drugs on top of that, and you'll recover like you never have before. So yeah, all that stuff, the high volume, that worked fantastically for people that were on all the drugs, but for naturals, outside of a very tiny percentage, which is what everyone focuses on. I've seen that argument too. Well, all the top bodybuilders, all the top naturals do this. Okay, fine. That means that 5% of humanity succeeds, but 95% of people that follow that high volume approach and that diet fail. Why did the 5% matter more than the 95%? Now, if I've got flexible dieting and more moderate training approaches, if 80% of people make progress, I got news for you. That approach is superior. Now, they may not reach the top, but they were never going to get to the top anyway. The elite can get away with stuff that the norms cannot. They've got advantages they don't even know about. But if 5% of people succeed with something and 95% fail, but a different approach, 80% of people succeed, that second approach, even if it's not traditional, is still working better.
This reminds me of the Air Alert vertical jump program, which is a horribly designed vertical jump program based around doing sets of 30, 40, 50 jumps.
Right.
And videos on YouTube of guys with 40-inch verticals dunking. I did Air Alert. It's like, no, those guys could dunk from the beginning of it.
Yes, and that's, CrossFit, not that I want to get into that big debate, but, they're claiming a couple of great athletes. Those guys were great athletes before they came to CrossFit. CrossFit did not make them into great athletes. CrossFit's just got them after the fact. And the elites will always be elites, almost in spite of what they do. But that 1 to 5% of the population isn't relative to most. And at the end of the day, I'm more interested in what's going to work for the majority than for that tiny minority.
Right. And so I think this is how you're kind of explaining it, because what really resonated with me, the way you're saying, is as a natural, it's hard to do several things at once. It's hard to, recover from a torturous amount of training volume, replenish glycogen, and then also on top of increase work capacity, and on top of that, actually increase the size of your muscle.
Yes.
Because
the body has, the Soviets conceptualized it as limited adaptational reserves, or whatever they called it. It was kind of a weird. The Russians didn't care, They wanted to know what worked, and they were like, you have a limited amount of adaptational reserves, and when you surpass that, the body can't recover. You look at guys, you look at specialists. Bench press specialists always outbench guys that have to do squat, bench, deadlift, because they can put all of their adaptational energy, or whatever you want to call it, into building that one set of muscle groups, that one exercise. There's a reason that decathletes, who have to be good at 10 things, are always inferior to specialists. Triathletes, they're getting better, they're catching up, but for the longest time, triathletes were basically mediocre at 3 things, and every runner, every cyclist, every swimmer could dust them in the individual events because they were able to put all of their energy into one thing. And when you're looking at bodybuilding, there is a limit to how much the human body, how much stress it can take, how much it can recover from on a day-to-day basis. There's also the limit to how much you can actually stimulate gains, right? You find that for any aspect, beyond a certain point, you're not stimulating further adaptations, but you are cutting into recovery. And I think Dante Trudel, dog crap training, which is sort of a rest pause, it's low-ish volume, but it's more volume than people realize. His goal explicitly was to generate the maximum stimulation with the minimum volume. Even going back to some of the, even Lee Haney, who was, 1980s, one of the top pro bodybuilders, his philosophy was stimulate, don't annihilate. He did about 6 to 8 sets per body part, which is right in line with what the research found, to be ideal. He'd done the high volume, he'd done the high intensity, and somewhere in the middle was kind of a happy medium for him. You want to stimulate gains and then get the hell out of the gym, because that's what's going to let you grow. And good coaches, there's kind of a threshold where, okay, this is the line that if you go above, you're doing too much. It's always slightly better to do a little bit too little than too much, because this will still stimulate gains. 80% of that maximum will still make you better. 120% will not in the long term. You can get away with it for a few weeks. So you're almost better to err slightly on the lower end. Of course, you can go to that other extreme. Then you get into high intensity training and that 1 set versus 20 set kind of thing, and that's just that sort of thing. But somewhere in the middle for most people is going to be that happy medium.
Yeah, I've noticed this with myself and so many clients is the more training you're doing, the harder it is to hit PRs.
Oh, yeah.
The more exercises, the more sets, it's so hard to hit those PRs. A few years ago, I started just, doing 2 exercises per muscle group, just 2 sets.
Yeah.
I was hitting PRs like crazy. And most people would think, okay, well, if you're just doing 2 sets on an exercise, how are you going to grow? And my response is, well, if you're doing 120-pound weighted chin-ups, your back can't be tiny. You can't.
Yeah, no, exactly. It was funny for decades. Everyone was like, well, no one really knows what makes muscle grow. And that really wasn't true. There's a paper I love to drag out from the early 80s by a researcher named Goldspink, and they had about 90% of the answer, which is progressive tension overload. It was called mechanism of mechanical work-induced hypertrophy. And it was a lot of animal work at the time, but it's all kind of scaled out, is muscles can respond to 2 things, tension and fatigue. Tension tends to stimulate increases in growth. Fatigue tends to stimulate increases, energy production and things like that. Powerlifting is at the tension extreme, endurance sports are at the endurance extreme, and bodybuilding is kind of in the middle, where there's a tension component, there's a fatigue component. We're finding there's different molecular pathways that stimulate growth and turn on protein synthesis, and that's not worth getting into. But bodybuilders figured out years ago that somewhere in that middle range of heavy with enough volume, that's what gives you the best results. And whether it's 5 to 8 reps or 8 to 12 or somewhere in that range that lets you get stronger over time. Again, it got muddied up when the drugs entered the picture. Suddenly it became about the pump and the feel and the squeeze, and you still see that. It's just about feeling the weight. And make no mistake, if you're not hitting the target muscle, if you're just throwing around heavy weights, that's not doing anything for you either. Go ahead.
Okay, I was going to say, I just had a little bit of a realization. I'm just wondering, why is it that all these drug users are gravitating to such high volume approaches? And I guess if you have 10 times the normal amount of testosterone flooding your body, you want to be in the gym. You get bored probably.
Yeah. And there's also there's a thing athletes tend to do, because everybody exaggerates. Everyone exaggerates how much they're doing, how much they're taking, and it's just part of the strategy of sport. And every athlete that's driven is like, there's a guy out there doing a little more than me. That's why people don't take a day off. Well, that day off, he's out there training. I need to be out there training. Well, I'm training twice a day. There's someone out there out training me, and it becomes a more is better approach. And invariably, it's not. I think also the high volume thing is just that's what they've always done. I mean, I agree they love being in the gym, but it's like, well, that's what they've always done, and so that's what they're going to continue to do. I think there's that aspect of it as well that makes it a little bit more problematic. But yeah, I mean, it's just like, hell, I still get people that are like, Arnold's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. You got to bomb and blitz and do 20 sets and all that other shit, and it just doesn't really work for most people because, you know, A, you're in the gym forever, B, you can't go heavy when you know you've got 19 more sets. You just can't do it. That is one place I think the high intensity training people, they have a point, which is if you've got one set, you give it your all, because you know you've only got one set to get it done. There's still a happy medium. You can do 6 to 8 sets or 4 to 8 or whatever and still go heavy. Dog crap, again, which I'll keep, and even in Borg Fagerly's mile reps, you know, same thing. You're always trying to beat your record book. That's a big part of the DC approach, which I really like, is he gets guys thinking, keep records, write your numbers down. Your goal is to beat those numbers. That's how he makes that a fundamental part of the system, that you have to be making ideally PRs over time. Now, we know that people aren't going to PR at every workout, but he's got some other things in the system that I'm not going to call them tricks, but it's ways of making it so people can do that. And over 6 to 8 weeks, most people can do that. Most people can push hard for 6 to 8 weeks, make continuous progress, then they back off for a couple of weeks. That's my general approach to bulking. He's got, you know, cruise and blasts, but it's all the same sort of thing. For 4 to 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, you can pretty much make some good progress. You need to back off, hit it again, back off, hit it again. Most people end up training at this mediocre level all the time, year-round, and that doesn't really get them anywhere.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because throughout my training career, I've gravitated to pretty much those strategies, like reverse pyramid training, where I just have that one heavy set and I can back off.
Yeah, you get the volume.
Right, and then I've also, in the last couple of years, been using the rest pause training. And
yes.
It's funny, the way I heard it described is because you've talked about how your work, you know, that 5 to 8 rep range is the sweet spot, because from the very first rep, you're getting a lot of muscle fiber recruitment comparative to doing 12, 15 reps, where those only kick in at the ends. But so the way I heard rest pause work being described is, you know, you're starting with that light weight for that first high rep set, but by only resting 10, 15, maybe 20 seconds,
yes,
you're still maintaining that high muscle fiber activation state.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And that's. I know that's how, you know, Blade, Borg Fagerly, has really conceptualized it. Is you do kind of that activation set to get all the fibers on. Now, if you took 2 or 3 minutes rest, they'll sort of fall off. You have to kind of re-recruit them. But by doing 2 or 3 reps every 10 to 15 seconds, you maintain high activation, high recruitment. He calls it getting more effective repetition. So rather than having to do 4 sets where the last 2 or 3 are effective, you do effectively 2 sets, but every repetition past the first 8 is going to be an effectively stimulating, where you're getting full recruitment, you're getting full rate coding, you're getting full all of that, but you're also getting that volume, that fatigue component. And it's a very well thought out system, make no mistake. But both Blade and Dog Crap have kind of gotten to the same place by a different route, but it accomplishes very much the same thing.
Right. I'm going to start using that. I like that saying, make no mistake. You don't hear it enough today. Yeah. I'm starting to catch on. Yeah, that's cool. I just found like that rest pause system to be genius for exercises that you can't go heavy on. Like you try and do 5 rep lateral raises, your muscles don't do anything. And so hitting those is very very fun. And are you still active on the body recomposition forums?
Oh yeah, no, that's, you know, I always run the forums, my Facebook stuff, and I don't have as much time, but I certainly do check in and to do support on my products, and you can always find me there. I suspect going forwards it'll be interesting. You know, I've seen Usenet, turn into listservs, turn into forums, and it seems like we're going to Facebook groups now. I think that's currently where most people are interacting, rather than, I think a lot of the forum software like vBulletin and stuff is kind of on the way out, because that's just an old interface, and Facebook is more immediate and more social and more informational. So I actually do have a Facebook group called Body Recomposition, so that's probably the best place to find me on Facebook.
Cool, yeah, I'm going to have to check that one out for sure.
That's it. Very good, Greg.
Yeah, thank you so much. Take care, and everyone, thank you for listening to the Road Trip Podcast. Till next time.